My name is Penelope. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've occupied roles that look unremarkable from the outside. I've been described as dependable, polite, easy to work with, the kind of woman people trust with responsibility, but never quite imagine holding power. If you pass me on the street, you might assume I'm a background character in someone else's story. And for a long time, that assumption worked in everyone else's favor. I'm sharing this story not because it's dramatic and not because it ends in revenge. It doesn't. I'm telling it because it's honest. And because for years, I didn't have language for what was happening to me. Only the quiet awareness that something was being decided on my behalf. This is the story of how I agreed to an arranged marriage, believing I was choosing stability, family alignment, and mutual respect, only to later discover the conditions in writing. Conditions that were never spoken aloud, conditions that assumed obedience, children on a schedule, and silence as a permanent state, not through force, not through cruelty, but through expectation. If you're looking for villains, you won't find any cartoon ones here. No shouting matches, no slammed doors. What you will find is something more common and more unsettling. A system of quiet dominance that works best when no one believes it exists. People often underestimate how power operates when it doesn't raise its voice, when it smiles, when it says, "This is just how things are done." I was raised to be adaptable, to keep harmony, to believe that patience was a virtue even when it cost me clarity. I was good at reading rooms, good at anticipating needs, good at disappearing in plain sight. This story moves slowly, because that's how it happened. It begins with small moments, easily dismissed, easily rationalized. It travels through long stretches of silence, where nothing seems wrong enough to confront, yet nothing feels right enough to relax. And it ends, not with triumph, but with alignment, with a choice that could not be undone once it was finally made. I'm not here to accuse. I'm not here to expose names. I'm here to document a psychological reversal that didn't rely on confrontation, but on awareness, on preparation, on understanding leverage long before it was ever used. As you listen, you might recognize pieces of your own life, or someone you know. You might feel uncomfortable, not because anything extreme happens, but because so much of it feels familiar. That discomfort isn't an instruction, it's simply information. I'll tell this story as clearly as I can, without exaggeration, and without pretending I understood everything while I was living it. I didn't. I only understood enough to keep going, until one day I understood enough to stop. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently and without judgment. Have you ever agreed to something because it felt expected, only to realize later that the expectations were far heavier than the words used to invite you in? Before the marriage was ever discussed, before contracts or conditions or signatures, I already had a role. I just didn't know it yet. To my family, I was the reasonable one, the daughter who didn't cause trouble, the one who adjusted. If plans changed, I adapted. If expectations shifted, I recalibrated. I was praised for being low maintenance, a phrase that sounds like a compliment until you realize it often means easy to overlook. At work, I was dependable. Not ambitious in a loud way. I didn't compete for attention or dominate meetings. I listened. I followed through. People trusted me with details they didn't want to manage themselves. I became the person who things quietly ran through, without anyone needing to acknowledge it. Systems worked, deadlines were met, and somehow, my presence felt optional even when my labor wasn't. Friends described me as calm, grounded, the one you could talk to without fear of being judged or interrupted. I held space well. I asked thoughtful questions. I rarely centered myself. When decisions were made in groups, I was often consulted, but rarely deferred to. My opinions were useful, not decisive. I didn't resent any of this, not at first. Invisibility can feel like safety when you've learned early that being noticed comes with conditions. I grew up understanding that love was often transactional, even when no one used that word. Approval followed compliance. Harmony followed silence. And I was very good at both. So when the idea of an arranged marriage was introduced, softly, carefully, framed as an opportunity rather than an obligation, I didn't recoil. It came through family connections, as these things often do. Not forced, not urgent, just suggested. A man from a respectable family, stable, educated, values aligned, they said. It wasn't presented as a surrender of choice, but as a narrowing of options, for my benefit. People assumed I would be open to it because I always was. You're practical, someone said. You don't need drama, said another. You understand how these things work. And they were right, in a way. I did understand how systems work. I understood compromise. I understood long-term thinking. I understood that love, as people described it, was often less important than compatibility, timing, and reputation. What I didn't yet understand was how thoroughly I had already been categorized. To them, I was not a woman with evolving desires. I was a solution. I fit neatly into other people's narratives. I wasn't expected to resist or demand or disrupt. I was expected to integrate, to smooth edges, to make things easier. No one asked me what I wanted in a marriage beyond surface questions. Did I want children someday? Yes, maybe. Did I value stability? Of course. Did I mind relocating, adjusting, accommodating another family's rhythms? I said I was flexible. Flexible became the key word. The man himself, let's call him Daniel, was polite, measured, not unkind. He spoke about responsibility, legacy, and continuity. He liked that I was composed, that I didn't challenge him unnecessarily, that I listened without correcting. You're very understanding, he told me once, as if that were an inherent trait, not a skill honed through years of observation. Our conversations were calm, predictable. There was nothing overtly wrong, and that was precisely what made everything so difficult to name. Because nothing felt like a warning, there were no raised voices, no demands, no ultimatums, just assumptions quietly stacking on top of each other. Like papers placed on a desk I hadn't realized was mine to clear. I was being evaluated not for who I was, but for how well I would maintain a structure that predated me. And I didn't protest. Not because I agreed with everything, but because at that stage, disagreement felt unnecessary, premature, almost rude. I told myself this was adulthood. This was maturity. This was choosing peace over impulse. What I didn't see yet was that everyone else already knew what they expected from me. They knew the shape I was supposed to take, the space I was meant to occupy. And they trusted that I would step into it quietly. I was useful, I was agreeable, I was steady. I was never asked if I intended to remain myself. The first sign wasn't dramatic, it never is. It was a sentence delivered gently during a conversation that was otherwise unremarkable. Daniel and I were discussing logistics, timelines, housing, the practical merging of two lives that were still, at that point, largely hypothetical. He said almost casually, "Of course. Once we're married, it'll be easier if you let me handle the major decisions. It avoids confusion." He smiled when he said it, not condescendingly, not dismissively, just confidently, as if this were a neutral statement, a reasonable assumption. I remember nodding, not because I agreed, but because the moment passed too quickly to examine. The sentence didn't land like an insult. It landed like a pebble, small, light, easy to step over. Later that evening, I replayed it in my head. Let me handle the major decisions. I told myself he meant finances or legal matters, or things he had more experience with. I told myself this was partnership pragmatism, not hierarchy. This is how the first small cuts work. They don't hurt enough to stop you. They hurt just enough to teach you to adjust your posture. A few weeks later, there was another moment. We were at a family dinner, both sides present. Someone asked me about my career plans, whether I intended to continue working after marriage. Before I could answer, Daniel said, "We'll see how it fits once things settle. Flexibility is important." Again, no one reacted. No one looked surprised. A few people nodded approvingly. The conversation moved on. I smiled. I always smiled. Inside, something tightened. Not painfully, just enough to register. I noticed how easily my voice had been replaced. Not overridden, substituted, as if the default assumption was that my perspective was already known and therefore didn't need to be spoken. After dinner, my mother pulled me aside and said softly, "He's very decisive. That's a good thing. You won't have to carry so much." I understood what she meant. I really did. In her world, Decisiveness in a man was protection, structure, relief. I didn't argue. I didn't correct her. I told myself she was right, that perhaps this was simply a different division of labor. But I started noticing patterns. Emails where Daniel would reply on my behalf, copying me in as an afterthought. Conversations where plans were described as mutual decisions, though I couldn't recall agreeing to them. Phrases like "we've decided" were used before I'd even been asked. Each incident on its own was trivial, easily excused. People around us certainly excused them. He's just proactive. He's thinking ahead. You two are already acting like a team. And maybe we were. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was being folded into something already shaped, rather than shaping it alongside him. The most unsettling part wasn't the behavior. It was the response it elicited from others, and from myself. No one saw these moments as disrespect, because they weren't framed that way. They were framed as efficient, leadership, stability, and I had been taught to value all three. So I adjusted. I began pausing before speaking, anticipating whether my input would be necessary. I edited my thoughts internally, offering only what seemed relevant to the direction already set. I told myself I was being considerate, strategic, mature, but there was a cost. I noticed how often I deferred without being asked. How easily I surrendered space, not because I lacked conviction, but because asserting it felt disruptive, unnecessary. I began to sense that my value in this arrangement was not my perspective, but my compliance. My ability to make things smooth, predictable, unchallenging. Still, I didn't label it as a problem. Problems, I believed then, announced themselves clearly. They demanded attention. They forced confrontation. This was none of that. This was polite, civil, almost invisible, which is why it worked. Because when something is small enough and everyone else treats it as normal, you start to question your own perception. You tell yourself you're overthinking, that you're being sensitive, that this is simply how partnerships evolve. I remember thinking, if this is the worst of it, I can adapt. I didn't yet understand that adaptation, repeated quietly, becomes erasure, and that the first small cut isn't meant to wound you. It's meant to teach you where the edge is. Once you explain something away enough times, it stops asking to be explained. That was the most dangerous shift. Not that the behavior continued, but that it began to feel ordinary, predictable, almost comforting in its consistency. Daniel started referring to our future as a completed draft. Not a discussion, but a document nearing final approval. He spoke in timelines and outcomes, rarely in questions. When we have our first child, once you've stepped back from work, after we settle into my parents' expectations. The language was subtle. There were no commands, just conclusions spoken as if they had already been reached together. The first few times I gently corrected him. We haven't decided that yet. Or, I'm not sure that's what I want. Each time he responded calmly. He would nod, smile, and say something like, "Of course, we'll talk about it properly later." Later rarely came. Instead, those assumptions would resurface weeks later, unchanged, as if my earlier hesitation had been a temporary misunderstanding rather than a position. I began to notice how often conversations ended not with resolution, but with postponement. My concerns were acknowledged, but never integrated, recognized, but never allowed to alter direction. It was an elegant system. Nothing was ever denied outright. It was simply delayed until it lost urgency. Family gatherings reinforced this dynamic. Decisions about holidays, living arrangements, and even my availability were discussed around me rather than with me. Someone would say, "You'll be free then, right?" And before I could answer, another voice would respond for me. I laughed it off. Everyone did. There's a strange social pressure that comes with politeness. When no one else sees an issue, raising one feels like breaking an unspoken agreement. You don't want to be the person who disrupts the mood, who introduces friction where none is acknowledged. So I stayed quiet. I told myself that this was a temporary imbalance, that once we were married, once I was officially part of the structure, my voice would carry more weight. That belief kept me compliant longer than I care to admit. I rationalized everything. He's under pressure from his family. This is a cultural difference. He's not malicious. He's just accustomed to leading. And perhaps all of that was true. But intent doesn't negate impact. What I felt increasingly was a slow narrowing, not of my freedom exactly, but of the range of responses available to me. Speaking up, felt increasingly futile. Silence felt increasingly efficient. I began to preemptively adjust my desires. I stopped imagining futures that didn't align with the one being presented to me. I edited my own expectations to avoid disappointment. This wasn't something Daniel asked me to do. I did it because it was easier. That's the part people don't talk about enough. How often compliance is self-generated. How power works best when it convinces you to participate in your own diminishment. The arranged marriage itself was now treated as a settled fact. Contracts were mentioned casually. Legal frameworks. Just formalities, everyone said. I hadn't seen anything in writing yet, but I assumed, naively, that paperwork would reflect what had been discussed verbally. Shared responsibility, mutual respect, compromise. After all, nothing alarming had been stated outright, and because nothing was explicit, everything remained deniable. I remember one afternoon, sitting alone with a cup of tea, realizing that I hadn't expressed a strong opinion in weeks, not because I didn't have any, but because I'd learned they weren't necessary. I told myself I was choosing peace. But peace, I was learning, can be a quiet agreement to disappear. The most unsettling realization came when I noticed that people seemed pleased with me, more than before. I was praised for being understanding, supportive, and low drama. The less I asserted myself, the more approval I received. That approval became its own reinforcement. So when small moments of discomfort arose, when a decision was made without me, when an expectation was stated as fact, I absorbed them without protest. I told myself they weren't worth addressing, that this was the price of stability. What I didn't yet see was that stability, in this context, was not neutral. It was maintained by keeping me predictable, agreeable, quiet, and by the time I began to feel truly unsettled, the pattern was already established. Disrespect, once normalized, stops looking like disrespect at all. It starts to look like the cost of belonging. It wasn't announced. No one sat me down and explained what was expected of me. The role was simply assumed. I began to see it clearly in how people spoke around me, rather than to me. In the way plans were described as inevitable. In the gentle surprise that met me whenever I expressed uncertainty. "You're so capable," someone said once, when I hesitated about taking on yet another responsibility related to the wedding logistics. "We just thought you'd handle it." Handle it. That was the word. I was the one who coordinated schedules, smoothed over misunderstandings, remembered preferences, and adjusted timelines. I was efficient, discreet, and emotionally literate. I noticed tensions before they escalated and quietly neutralized them. From the outside, it looked like competence. From the inside, it felt like containment. The role I was being shaped into wasn't that of a partner. It was that of a stabilizer. Someone whose primary function was to absorb friction so the structure remained intact. I was expected to be reliable, useful, and invisible. Daniel didn't demand this of me explicitly. In many ways, he simply benefited from a system that had already decided what kind of woman I was. He stepped into his role as decisively as I stepped into mine as support. When I expressed fatigue, it was met with reassurance, not relief. "You're strong," he'd say. "You can handle it." Strength, I learned, was being used as a justification for endurance. The more capable I appeared, the less support I was offered. The more composed I remained, the less my internal strain registered as real. I remember a moment when I suggested delegating some tasks. The response was immediate but subtle. A pause. A look was exchanged between family members. Then a comment, "But you're so good at this." It wasn't an argument. It was a reminder. Good at this is a difficult label to escape. It implies obligation disguised as praise. I began to understand that my value in this arrangement was not negotiable. It was fixed, and it was contingent on my continued willingness to perform without complaint. Any deviation, even a request for rest, felt like a breach of contract I hadn't known I'd signed. I also noticed how little space there was for my uncertainty. Doubt made people uncomfortable. It disrupted the narrative that everything was proceeding smoothly, sensibly, as planned. So I stopped voicing it. Instead, I observed. I watched how Daniel interacted with others, how decisiveness was rewarded, how authority was assumed rather than earned. I watched how often his preferences became defaults, how rarely mine were even recorded. I watched myself become quieter, not withdrawn, just efficient. I spoke when necessary. I agreed when expected. I performed the role with precision, and the system responded exactly as it was designed to. There was no pushback, no conflict, no resistance, which should have reassured me. But instead it unsettled me deeply, because harmony that requires one person to compress themselves indefinitely is not harmony at all. It's management. Still, I didn't rebel. I didn't confront. I didn't even articulate my discomfort clearly to myself. I told myself this was temporary, that once things were finalized, once the wedding was over, once life settled, there would be space to renegotiate. That belief later became my quiet anchor. What I didn't realize then was that roles, once fully assumed, are rarely renegotiated without consequence, and that every day I performed mine without question, I was reinforcing its permanence. The role I was assigned was elegant in its simplicity. Be useful, be flexible, be quiet, and above all, do not disrupt. I was fulfilling it flawlessly, which is why no one noticed when something in me began to shift. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no dramatic realization, no moment where everything suddenly made sense. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a room I had been in many times before. I was alone, reviewing documents that had been emailed to me under the subject line preliminary agreement. Just paperwork, I'd been told. Formalities, nothing urgent. I almost didn't open it right away. That detail matters because it reflects how little I expected to find anything meaningful there. I assumed it would mirror the conversations we'd had. General language, flexible phrasing, mutual intentions expressed in neutral legal terms. Instead, it read like a set of instructions. Not overtly cruel, not threatening, just precise. Clauses about household authority, about decision-making precedents, about expectations around children, timelines, roles, responsibilities, about discretion, about privacy, about maintaining family unity through restraint. And then there was the word that stopped me, obedience. It wasn't emphasized. It wasn't dramatic. It sat quietly in the middle of a paragraph, defined clinically, framed as cooperation and alignment. I reread the sentence several times, not because I didn't understand it, but because part of me was still waiting for it to mean something else. It didn't. What unsettled me most wasn't the content itself, it was the tone. The document assumed consent, assumed compliance, assumed silence. It wasn't asking who I was. It was describing who I would be. I closed the document and sat there longer than I meant to. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I felt something colder and more clarifying than either. Recognition. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was coherence. Everything I had rationalized, minimized, absorbed, it all aligned perfectly with what was now written down. The small cuts, the normalized dismissal, the role assignment, none of it had been accidental. The system hadn't failed to include me. It had included me exactly as intended. That was the moment something shifted, not externally, but internally. For the first time, I stopped asking why this was happening and started asking, how does this work? I reread the document slowly, not as a participant, but as an observer. I noticed what was specified and what was left vague, where authority was clearly defined, where flexibility existed only on one side. I noticed that my silence had been assumed so thoroughly that it had been codified. And I noticed something else too. The document was meticulous, which meant it was vulnerable. Systems that rely on compliance often reveal themselves fully on paper. They explain their logic, their priorities, their pressure points. I realized sitting there that nothing in that document was spontaneous. It had been drafted with intention, reviewed, and refined. It reflected values that had been quietly enacted long before they were written. And in that clarity, something in me settled. I didn't feel angry. Anger would have been easier. Anger invites reaction. What I felt instead was distance, a subtle but irreversible separation between who I had been performing as and who I actually was. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't ask for explanations. I didn't announce my discomfort. I saved the document. I made notes. I began to understand that silence, up until that point, had been a default, an expectation, a habit. But it didn't have to remain that way. Silence could become something else, not absence. Choice. That afternoon didn't change my behavior outwardly. I attended dinners. I responded to messages. I smiled when expected. But internally, I stopped assuming goodwill. I started assuming structure. And once you see the structure clearly, you can decide whether to live inside it or step out of it. That was the day I stopped disappearing unconsciously and began paying attention. After that day, nothing about my outward life changed. And that was intentional. I didn't want disruption. I didn't want suspicion. I certainly didn't want a premature confrontation. What I wanted was time. Time to observe without being observed. Time to understand the full scope of what I was standing inside. So I stayed quiet. But this time, my silence was not compliance. It was calibration. I stopped filling gaps in conversation. I let assumptions pass without immediate correction. Not because I accepted them, but because I wanted to see how far they extended. I wanted to know which expectations were fixed and which were merely habitual. The difference was subtle, but it changed everything. People mistook my continued composure for agreement. They relaxed further. They became more transparent. When you stop resisting, systems reveal their contours. Daniel grew more certain. He spoke more freely about future plans, timelines, and expectations. He referenced the agreement casually now, as if it were already settled law. He assumed I had read it. He assumed I had accepted it. And because I didn't contradict him, he assumed correctly, just not in the way he thought. I listened. I noted which decisions were framed as negotiable and which were not. I noticed how often family harmony was used to justify unilateral choices. I noticed how obedience was never spoken aloud, but regularly implied. Silence, in this phase, was not passivity. It was information gathering. I also noticed how others responded to my quiet. Some seemed relieved. My lack of resistance smoothed interactions. It reassured people that everything was proceeding as planned. A few interpreted my silence as trust. That interpretation worked in my favor. At work, I was accustomed to reading systems, to understand where authority actually resided versus where it was publicly displayed. This wasn't new terrain. I had simply never applied those skills so personally before. Now I did. I began documenting, not emotionally, but factually. Dates, statements, assumptions, language used repeatedly, patterns of decision-making. I wasn't building a case yet. I was building clarity. What surprised me most was how little effort this required. Once I stopped reacting, the information came to me. People tell you who they are when they believe you've already agreed. I also began to examine my own position within the structure. What was expected of me? What was I providing emotionally, logistically, socially? And what, if anything, was being preserved in my name? The answers were sobering. My role was essential, but my autonomy was optional. That realization could have frightened me. Instead, it focused me, because essential roles are not as powerless as they appear, especially when the system depends on them functioning quietly. I didn't change my tone. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't create distance. I created precision. Every yes became intentional. Every no was simply delayed. I asked clarifying questions that sounded cooperative but revealed boundaries in the fine print. How would that work legally? What happens if circumstances change? Is there documentation for that expectation? Each question was received calmly. None was resisted, because they didn't sound like opposition. They sounded like diligence. I was very good at diligence, and in that space I began to see that silence, chosen deliberately, has a different texture than silence imposed. Chosen silence listens. Chosen silence waits. Chosen silence prepares. I no longer felt invisible. I felt unseen by design, and that distinction mattered, because being unseen is not the same as being powerless. It simply means no one is watching you closely, and when no one is watching, you can move, quietly. What they never noticed was how much space my quiet gave me. While everyone else relaxed into certainty, I became deliberate, methodical. I didn't rush. I didn't dramatize. I didn't even frame what I was doing as preparation at first. It felt more like orientation, learning the dimensions of a room I hadn't realized I was standing in. I reread the agreement several times over the following weeks, not in one sitting, but in sections. I treated it the way I would treat a complex operational document at work, mapping dependencies, identifying assumptions, and noting ambiguities. I paid close attention to what was clearly defined and what was merely implied. Authority was specified in detail. Obligations were explicit on my side and contextual on his. Silence was described as discretion. Compliance was framed as cooperation. But there were gaps. Every system has them. There were clauses that relied on mutual understanding, without defining what happened when understanding broke down. There were references to family consensus that assumed alignment but never established enforcement mechanisms. There were financial structures that depended on my continued contribution. Logistical, managerial, reputational, without granting me corresponding authority. The structure assumed I would continue performing as I always had. That assumption was its weakness. At the same time, I began to quietly strengthen areas of my life that had nothing to do with the marriage, at least not on the surface. I reviewed my finances with fresh eyes. Accounts, assets, liabilities. I made sure everything tied to my name was clear, documented, and accessible. I didn't hide anything. I simply organized it. I updated the records, consolidated where it made sense, created redundancies where it didn't. This wasn't secrecy, it was independence. I also began paying closer attention to how information flowed within Daniel's family. Who spoke to whom? Who deferred? Who decided? Who simply enforced decisions made elsewhere? Power, I learned, didn't always sit with the loudest voice. It often resided with whoever managed continuity. I had been doing that work informally for months, coordinating, smoothing, remembering. I now understand its value, and I understood what would happen if it were withdrawn. Still, I didn't withdraw it. Not yet. I continued to show up, continued to be pleasant, continued to fulfill expectations just enough to maintain stability. Because preparation isn't about disruption, it's about optionality. The most important thing I did during this period was internal. I stopped imagining myself as someone trying to be included. I started seeing myself as someone evaluating whether inclusion was acceptable. That shift changed how I listened. When Daniel spoke about the future, I no longer heard promises. I heard the requirements. When others spoke about tradition, I heard enforcement. When silence was praised, I heard control. And because I wasn't emotionally reactive, I could hear these things clearly, without defensiveness or denial. I also noticed how little anyone asked me direct questions anymore. They assumed alignment, assumed agreement, assumed I was on board. That assumption created a strange kind of freedom. No one monitors what they believe is already secured. I began documenting more formally now. Not obsessively, just accurately. Statements, expectations, written communication. I kept copies, not as weapons, but as references. Clarity is a form of safety. There was one moment, small but revealing, when Daniel mentioned an adjustment to the agreement. Something minor, presented as a courtesy. "I didn't think you'd mind," he said. "It's in line with everything else." I smiled and said, "I'll need to read it." He hesitated just for a fraction of a second. That hesitation told me everything. They weren't afraid of my refusal. They were unaccustomed to my review. And that, more than anything, confirmed I was preparing correctly. Because power systems don't collapse when you argue with them. They weaken when you understand them better than they understand themselves. And by then, I did. What they never noticed was that my silence had given me time, and access, and perspective. They thought I was still adapting. In reality, I was positioning. The reveal didn't come from a conversation. It came from alignment. There was no single document, no dramatic clause suddenly uncovered that changed everything. What emerged instead was a complete picture, assembled slowly, quietly, from pieces that had always been there. One evening, after everyone else had gone to sleep, I spread everything out in front of me. Not physically, this wasn't theatrical, but mentally. The agreement, my notes, financial structures, family dynamics, legal assumptions, social expectations, and I saw it. Not the trap, not the injustice, the leverage. Up until that point, I had been reading the agreement as someone subject to it. That night, I read it as someone assessing risk. The structure assumed continuity, my continued presence, my ongoing emotional labor, my willingness to manage complexity without acknowledgement. The agreement outlined obedience, but it never addressed enforcement beyond social pressure. It assumed silence, but only because silence had always been given freely. It required my participation far more than it constrained me. That was the realization. I was not replaceable in the way the system believed I was. I wasn't valuable because of who I was to them emotionally. I was valuable because of what I stabilized. And stability is fragile when it depends on one person choosing not to move. I felt no excitement in this discovery. No sense of victory, only clarity. Because leverage isn't power in itself. It's a responsibility. It tells you that whatever you do next will have consequences, not just for you, but for everyone who has built their expectations around your compliance. That weight settled on me calmly. I also realized something else, equally important. Nothing in the agreement protected me if I followed it perfectly. Obedience didn't guarantee respect. Silence didn't guarantee security. Children didn't guarantee permanence. The system rewarded compliance with continued expectation, not safety. That meant the risk was asymmetrical. If I stayed, everything depended on my endurance. If I left, everything depended on their adaptability. And adaptability was not their strength. I sat with that understanding for a long time, not to justify anything, not to strategize immediately, but to let go of the idea that I was betraying anyone by seeing the truth clearly. Because clarity is not betrayal, it's adulthood. The private reveal wasn't dramatic. It didn't change my expression, my tone, or my behavior the next day. No one noticed anything different. But internally, the last illusion dissolved. I was no longer waiting for permission to feel uneasy. I was no longer assuming misunderstanding. I was no longer hoping things would evolve naturally. I accepted that the system was functioning exactly as designed, and that meant any change would have to be deliberate. The question was no longer, is this fair? The question became, what am I willing to live inside? Once that question is asked honestly, it cannot be unanswered. And I knew, quietly without panic, that I was approaching a point of no return. There is a moment, not dramatic, not loud, when clarity stops being theoretical and becomes ethical. That was where I found myself. Up until then, everything I had done could still be framed as observation, preparation, prudence. I hadn't disrupted anything. I hadn't taken a stand. I hadn't even decided what I wanted yet. But clarity creates pressure. Once you understand the structure you're inside, continuing to move as if you don't is no longer neutral. It becomes a decision in itself. I saw 3 paths in front of me, and I took them seriously. I didn't rush past any of them. The first was compliance. I could sign the agreement as written. I could adjust myself fully to the role that had been outlined. I could become what was expected, obedient, silent, accommodating, and trust that I would find meaning inside that structure. Many people do, and some of them are not unhappy. But I knew myself well enough to understand the cost. Compliance would require me to slowly detach from my own internal authority, to treat my instincts as inconveniences, to manage my discomfort indefinitely. I could survive that. I could not respect myself inside it. The second option was negotiation. I could raise concerns, request revisions, ask for clearer protections, try to rebalance the agreement from within the system. This was the option most people assumed I would take, if I took any at all. It sounded reasonable, mature, collaborative, but I also understood the system well enough by then to know how it handled resistance. Concerns would be acknowledged but reframed. Revisions would be discussed but delayed. Protections would be promised verbally but softened in writing. Negotiation would not dismantle the structure. It would legitimize it, and once legitimized, it would become even harder to leave. The third option was withdrawal. Not a dramatic withdrawal, not confrontation, no explanation, just refusal to proceed. This was the option no one expected, because it didn't fit the narrative they had built around me. It didn't align with my perceived temperament. It didn't allow for discussion, persuasion, or correction. It was irreversible, and that was what made it honest. I spent several days sitting with that understanding. I didn't talk myself into it. I didn't justify it emotionally. I simply noticed which option allowed me to remain intact. Only one did. The decision wasn't fueled by anger. It wasn't about punishing anyone. It wasn't even about proving a point. It was about consent. True consent isn't just saying yes when asked politely. It's having the ability to say no without fear of collapse. And I realized that if I signed that agreement, even with revisions, I would be consenting to a life where my autonomy existed only at the margins. So I chose withdrawal, quietly. I didn't announce it immediately. Decisions like this don't need witnesses to be real. They need follow-through. Once the decision was made, something in me settled completely. The mental noise stopped. The constant calculation ended. There was grief, of course. Not for the man exactly, but for the version of the future that had been outlined so confidently. For the simplicity of believing I could adapt my way into belonging. But grief and clarity can coexist. And clarity, once reached, does not argue with itself. I knew that what came next would be complex, that there would be confusion, disappointment, even attempts to reframe my choice as fear or misunderstanding. But those were external reactions. Internally, there was no debate left. I had reached the decision point, and I stepped through it. Once the decision was made, I didn't rush to reveal it. Urgency would have been emotional. I needed precision. So I moved the way I always had, quietly, methodically, without drawing attention to the fact that anything had changed. From the outside, I was still cooperative, still present, still to everyone else's eyes, on track. But internally, every action now had a single purpose: clean separation. I began with logistics because logistics don't provoke suspicion. They look responsible, practical, mature. I ensured that all my personal documents were in order and accessible: identification, financial records, and employment contracts. I reviewed shared plans and timelines, not to fulfill them, but to understand dependencies. What relied on my participation? What would falter without it? At work, I adjusted nothing. That stability mattered. Independence is easier to maintain when one pillar of your life remains steady and unquestioned. Socially, I didn't withdraw. Withdrawal invites inquiry. I attended dinners. I responded to messages. I remained pleasant. People confuse presence with commitment. That confusion worked in my favor. I declined to sign anything new, always politely, always with reason. I need more time to review. I'd like legal clarity on this section. Let's revisit this after the next milestone. No one pushed hard. They weren't accustomed to needing to. What they didn't realize was that momentum, their greatest ally, was quietly dissolving. Every delay slowed the machine. Every unanswered assumption loosened its grip. I also stopped volunteering solutions. That was harder than it sounds. For years, my instinct had been to smooth, coordinate, and resolve. Now, I let small inefficiencies remain. Not dramatically, just enough to reveal how much invisible labor I had been providing. When questions arose, I answered only what was asked. When confusion surfaced, I didn't rush to clarify. I was still kind, still composed, just no longer compensating. The effect was subtle but cumulative. Timelines began to wobble. Communication became less fluid. Minor frictions appeared where none had existed before. No one blamed me, not yet. They assumed stress, complexity, temporary misalignment. They still believed the system was intact. Meanwhile, I prepared for the moment when silence would no longer suffice. I drafted a statement, not to justify myself, but to anchor myself. Clear, minimal, unemotional. I didn't plan to send it immediately. I needed to know exactly what I would say when the time came, so I wouldn't be pulled into negotiation by surprise. I also considered the fallout. Who would be confused? Who would be disappointed? Who would attempt to reinterpret my decision as hesitation rather than refusal? I accepted that. Moving in silence doesn't mean avoiding consequences. It means choosing when they arrive. There was a strange calm in this phase. Not relief exactly, but alignment. For the first time in months, my actions matched my understanding. I wasn't pretending anymore, and yet no one noticed. That was the most telling part. The system hadn't changed its expectations of me, even as I quietly removed myself from fulfilling them. They still thought I was moving toward them. In reality, I was moving away, carefully, cleanly, without leaving loose ends. Because when you leave a structure like this, the most powerful thing you can take with you is composure. And I intended to leave with mine fully intact. Consequences don't always arrive with impact. Sometimes they arrive in confusion. The first sign wasn't confrontation. It was a pause, a delay in response time, a meeting that ended without resolution, a plan that didn't quite move forward the way it was supposed to. I noticed it immediately. They did not. The system had been designed to run smoothly because I had been smoothing it. When that invisible pressure was removed, even gently, things began to drift. Not collapse, drift. Daniel became more preoccupied, not alarmed, just unsettled. He double-checked timelines, asked more questions. He started repeating himself, as if clarity could be restored through emphasis. At one dinner, he said, "We should really finalize things soon," with a tone that suggested agreement had already been reached. I nodded, non-committal. That hesitation, so minor, so polite, created more tension than any argument would have. Because systems built on assumptions don't know how to respond to neutrality. Others began to feel it too. Family members started asking logistical questions that had once been unnecessary. Who was coordinating what? Whether certain plans were confirmed. If I were aware of changes that had already been discussed, I answered calmly, "I'll need to check. I'm not sure yet. That hasn't been finalized." Each response was truthful. Each one revealed a gap. No one accused me of withdrawing. They didn't yet realize that withdrawal was what was happening. Instead, they experienced a vague sense of loss, of efficiency, of certainty, of ease. and loss without explanation is deeply unsettling. I watched how quickly unease spread when predictability vanished. How often do people rely on one person's quiet labor to keep their world coherent? Still, I wasn't blamed. That came later. At this stage, there was only confusion. Daniel asked me one evening gently, "Are you feeling overwhelmed?" It was the closest he came to noticing me as a variable rather than a constant. I said, "I'm being more careful." He frowned slightly, as if that answer didn't quite fit anywhere. The thing about consequences is that they reveal dependencies retroactively. Only when something is missing do people realize how much they relied on it. I had always been present enough to prevent discomfort. Now discomfort appeared, not dramatic, just persistent. Schedules slipped, assumptions had to be clarified, decisions stalled without my quiet endorsement, and the system began to feel heavier, not broken, just less efficient, which was enough to create anxiety. What struck me most was how quickly that anxiety searched for resolution. People wanted to restore the old rhythm, not examine why it had worked so well in the first place. They wanted my silence back. But silence, once reclaimed, doesn't return to being automatic. I could see the shift happening before anyone named it. The subtle recalibration, the growing awareness that something essential is no longer being provided freely. And still, no one asked the central question. No one asked whether I was still consenting. They only felt the absence of my compliance. That was the consequence. Not anger, not conflict. Loss of ease. And loss of ease is often the first thing people notice when power dynamics begin to change. By the time they tried to address it, the problem was no longer what they thought it was. What they noticed was a delay, hesitation, a lack of forward motion. What they didn't notice was that the forward motion had already ended. The first attempt to fix things came disguised as concern. Daniel suggested we sit down and clear the air. Not because there was conflict, he said, but because things felt off. He spoke carefully, as if choosing the wrong word might create the very problem he was trying to avoid. I listened. He talked about pressure, about expectations from both families, about how complicated things become when timelines slip. He emphasized how much smoother everything would feel once the agreement was finalized. He never asked if I still wanted it. Instead, he spoke as if the solution was reassurance. If I could just be reminded of the benefits, the stability, the logic, everything would realign. I thanked him for the conversation. I didn't commit to anything. That unsettled him more than disagreement would have. After that, the tone shifted. Not aggressively, strategically. Family members began reaching out individually. Soft check-ins, casual messages, invitations framed as opportunities to reconnect. "You've been so quiet lately. We just want to make sure you're okay. These things can be overwhelming. We're here to help." Help in this context meant re-engagement. They weren't trying to pressure me. They were trying to restore the previous equilibrium. But equilibrium depends on participation, and I was no longer participating. What none of them realized was that this stage, panic masked as concern, always arrives too late. Because once someone has stopped internally negotiating, external persuasion has nothing to attach to. They tried reframing the agreement as flexible. They highlighted sections that could be interpreted generously. They emphasized trust, intention, and good faith, all the things that should have been established before asking for obedience. I listened politely. I nodded. I said very little, because explanations invite debate, and debate assumes the outcome is still undecided. It wasn't. The irony was that had anyone asked me earlier, truly asked, whether I felt aligned, things might have unfolded differently. But the system had never required my alignment, only my presence. Now they mistook my calm for uncertainty. It wasn't uncertainty. It was completion. The more they tried to fix things, the clearer it became that they didn't know what had broken. They were treating symptoms, slowness, hesitation, distance, without addressing the cause. They couldn't imagine that I had already left the structure psychologically, because people rarely believe that quiet people leave first. Eventually, the conversations took on a different tone, less reassuring, more urgent. We need to move forward. People are asking questions. This can't stay unresolved. I acknowledged the inconvenience. I did not take responsibility for it. That distinction mattered, because inconvenience is not harm, and urgency does not create consent. By the time they realized that I was no longer available to be reassured, persuaded, or redirected, the only option left was confrontation. And by then, there was nothing left to fix. The confrontation, when it finally came, was quieter than anyone expected. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic ultimatums. Just a table, a scheduled conversation, and the unspoken understanding that something had reached its limit. Daniel asked me directly this time, "Are you having second thoughts?" It was the first question he had asked that acknowledged uncertainty as real. I answered honestly, "I'm not proceeding." I didn't qualify it. I didn't soften it. I didn't explain it immediately. Silence followed, not the heavy kind, the recalibrating kind. He looked at me, searching for something, hesitation, doubt, an opening. I didn't provide one. When I did speak again, it was measured. I read the agreement carefully. I understand what it requires. I don't consent to it. He responded with logic. He talked about intention versus interpretation, about how things sound harsher on paper, about trust. I listened. Then I said calmly, "If the paper doesn't reflect the intention, the paper needs to change. And even if it did, I still wouldn't agree." That was the moment he understood this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a refusal. He asked why. I told him the truth. Not everything, but enough. I'm not willing to enter a structure where my autonomy depends on goodwill rather than protection. He frowned, not angrily, confused. "But we could adjust things," he said. "We can talk." I nodded. "You can, I'm not." That was the hardest part to say. Not because it was cruel, but because it closed the door to negotiation. I wasn't rejecting him personally. I was rejecting the system he represented and benefited from. Family members joined the conversation later, concerned, disappointed, controlled. They spoke about compromise, about timing, about how much had already been invested. I acknowledged all of it. "I understand the inconvenience," I said. "I'm still not proceeding." They tried to reframe my decision as fear, as pressure, as confusion. I corrected them gently. "This isn't fear, it's clarity." Clarity is difficult for people to argue with because it doesn't seek validation. The room was quiet again. There was no explosion, no dramatic fallout, just the slow realization that persuasion would not work, and that the person they thought they knew was no longer available in the way they expected. I wasn't emotional, I wasn't defensive. I was finished. When the conversation ended, I stood up, thanked them for their time, and left. That was it. No further debate, no follow-up messages trying to convince me otherwise. They had reached the boundary, and boundaries, once calmly enforced, don't invite discussion. They simply stand. After everything ended, people expected a transformation. They expected relief or grief or anger, some visible marker that a dramatic internal shift had taken place. What they didn't expect was how ordinary my life became. Not immediately, of course. There was an adjustment. There were quiet moments where I noticed the absence of plans that had once filled my calendar. There were questions I no longer had to answer, expectations I no longer had to manage. But there was no chaos. What replaced the structure I left behind was not freedom in a cinematic sense. It was something quieter and far more sustainable. Alignment. For the first time in a long while, my days required no internal negotiation. I didn't need to anticipate reactions, soften truths, or prepare myself to absorb disappointment on behalf of others. I made decisions, and they belonged to me. That may sound small. It isn't. I noticed how much energy I had been spending maintaining an equilibrium that was never truly mine. Without that labor, my attention returned to places I hadn't realized I'd abandoned. I re-engaged with my work, not as a refuge, but as a domain where my authority was clear and respected. I invested in relationships that were reciprocal, where listening flowed both ways, and I sat by myself. That was the most unfamiliar part. Without the constant role-playing, I had to rediscover who I was when no one was shaping me, when no outcome depended on my compliance. What I found wasn't bitterness or distrust. It was discernment. I became slower to agree, more precise with my words, less inclined to fill the silence. I didn't explain myself unless the explanation was genuinely useful. People noticed the change. Some interpreted it as confidence, others as distance. Both were partially true. I wasn't hardened, I was defined. The experience didn't make me cynical about partnership or commitment. It made me clearer about consent, about structure, about the difference between stability that supports you and stability that contains you. I no longer confuse endurance with virtue. I no longer equate silence with peace. And I no longer accept roles that require my disappearance in exchange for belonging. What surprised me most was how little resentment I carried. I didn't feel wronged in a way that demanded recompense. I felt educated. I had seen a system from the inside, understood how quietly it operates, how easily it recruits people who are conscientious, adaptable, and well-intentioned. and I had chosen to step out before it finalized me. That choice didn't make me exceptional. It made me honest. I am still calm, still measured, still thoughtful. But now, those qualities belong to me, not to a structure that benefits from my restraint. I am no longer underestimated, not because others suddenly see me differently, but because I no longer rely on being seen correctly to act in my own interest. That is who I am now. There's a temptation when a story like this ends to look for a clear moral, a warning label, a single sentence that explains what went wrong and how to avoid it. But life rarely offers lessons that cleanly. What I took from this experience wasn't that arranged systems are inherently harmful, or that tradition is automatically oppressive, or even that the people involved acted with ill intent. Those conclusions would be too easy and too comforting. The harder truth is this: structures don't need to be cruel to be controlling. They only need to be efficient. What I encountered wasn't hostility. It was designed. A system that functioned smoothly because it relied on people like me, capable, adaptable, conflict-averse, to absorb its weight without complaint. And for a long time I did. Not because I was weak, but because I was trained to be reasonable. That's what makes quiet dominance so difficult to recognize. It doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It thanks you for your understanding while slowly removing your options. It praises your strength while depending on your endurance. And it works best when everyone involved believes they are being fair. The moment that changed everything for me wasn't the discovery of a clause or a word like obedience written in legal language. It was realizing that my consent had been assumed long before it was requested, and that assumption had already shaped the outcome. Consent given under momentum is not the same as consent given freely. Silence maintained to keep peace is not the same as silence chosen from clarity. And stability that requires one person to disappear is not stability at all. I didn't leave with anger. I didn't leave with a sense of victory. I left with something quieter and more durable: self-trust. Trust in my ability to read situations accurately. Trust in my right to withdraw when alignment no longer exists. Trust in the understanding that saying no does not require a performance. If there's one thing I hope stays with you after hearing this story, it's this: pay attention to what is being decided without you. Notice where your flexibility is being treated as an entitlement, and be honest about whether the peace you're preserving is mutual or simply convenient for others. Not every system needs to be fought. Some only need to be exited, quietly, cleanly, completely. And sometimes the most powerful reversal isn't confrontation at all. It's the moment you stop making yourself smaller to fit a shape that was never meant for you. If this story resonated with you, even uncomfortably, I'd like to ask you one final question, and I invite you to answer it in the comments. Have you ever realized, too late or just in time, that you were being valued more for your compliance than for your consent? Your answer might help someone else recognize their own moment of clarity. And that, I've learned, is often where change really begins.